Hi, and thank you for tuning in today for our event with the wonderful Alexander McCall Smith and just as wonderful Joseph Kanon. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 26th year. Joe joins us from New York, Sandy from Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'm here in Los Angeles. I love Sandy McCall Smith's books because they're simply so fun, so delightful, and so full of humanity. The book we're using as an excuse to host him here today is The Joy and Light Bus Company, another installment in the Ladies Number One Detective Agency series. But McCall Smith is not just about our practical genius crime solver in Botswana. He writes other great series too. Some of you might be fans of the Varg detective series, which are the perfect and really funny antidotes to your run-of-the-mill wrenching and violent Nordic thrillers. McCall Smith is anything but that. His 44 Scotland Street series explores the deepest mysteries that pop up in Edinburgh. I don't know how he does it in each and every book. He elevates the quotidian and mundane moments of life into meaningful and affirming quests. I love him and thank him for that. Alexander McCall Smith is a complete pleasure for me, one of the most calming and relaxing writers I can think of. You will have questions. Email us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com and we'll try to address them. Joseph Kanon, well, he's another story. His books are literally thrilling. This is his latest. Give me a book with a spy on the cover and I can be the happiest person on earth. Hand me a Kanon book and I become the happiest person on earth. His novels about post-war Berlin are heart-stopping. And if you haven't read Leaving Berlin or The Good German or The Berlin Exchange, you must. And then calm yourself down with a quick dose of the Ladies Number One Detective series. Again, email us your questions at writersblockpresents.com. Also, I want to direct you to our website, writersblockpresents.com, so that you can find the link to Book Soup and get copies of Alexander McCall Smith's new book, The Joy and Light Bus Company. This is our last program of 2021, and what a year it's been. We love your tax-deductible contributions, and thank you in advance. I'm so happy to present Alexander McCall Smith and Joseph Kanon.
But thanks, Andrea. That was just lovely. Sandy, let's start this way. I was looking at the book again before we started this session, and I realized that it opens with the scene that appears almost without fail in every single Ladies Number One Detective Agency book, which is Mma Ramotswe sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and sort of taking her ease and just slowing the day down and giving some thought to what's going on. I then thought, this is the 22nd book in a series. I believe your total output is now around 70 books. You must be the busiest writer on the planet. Do you ever sit back with a cup of tea and take your ease and reflect?
Yes, well, Joe, I do actually. I must say, if I could say something about the drinking of tea in these books, that a lot of people feel that the tea has some sort of significance, that when the characters are having a cup of tea, something is being said about the world or about their view of the world. In fact, it really isn't. A cup of tea I can thoroughly recommend as a way of actually keeping the book going while you're trying to think of what's going to happen next. I don't know whether your characters probably have a martini or a coffee or something something of that sort.
Actually, in those days, they could still smoke, and I find it's really useful to light a cigarette while you're thinking what to say next.
Exactly. It's the same. That's the same sort of trick as the trick that I use. But I do like to slow things down in a way because I think that the world is a very frenzied place. I know it's rather trite to say it, but it is an extremely frenzied place. Our lives are far too busy. There's far too much busyness in our lives. So I think that people respond rather well to being told or having a scene described to them in which nothing very much is happening. Now, you can't get away with that too much, because if you did a book which just consisted of somebody sitting on the veranda drinking tea, then the readers may disappear. But I think that we probably are all looking for moments of quiet in our life. And I think if one can do that in a book without boring the readers too much, it's probably quite a good thing.
You know, I used to be looking for quiet in my life until the pandemic hit, and then we had a lot too much of it.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, Joe, I don't know whether I mentioned this to you before, but when the pandemic hit, I happened, just entirely coincidentally, to be reading Patrick Leigh Fermore's A Time to Keep Silence, which, as you know, is an account of his visit to various French monasteries in the 1950s, including some Trappist monasteries. And I was reading also another book on monasticism by a Benedictine abbot who was writing about the relevance of monasticism in the 21st century, which really prior to the lockdown wasn't necessarily the most topical of books. So I actually was reading about the importance of quiet and having a quiet time, and then along came the real thing. And I must say that I know that it's been a time of great sorrow for many people, and it's been a very difficult time, obviously, for so many people. But it also has been a time of correction when we actually have been able to appreciate quiet a bit. I was listening the other day to aeroplanes taking off. I suddenly realized that I could hear the sound of aeroplanes taking off from Edinburgh Airport, which is not a sound that I'd really heard very much over the last 18 months. And I found myself thinking it will be a pity if the noise and clamor that we saw sort of put to one side during the pandemic returns unabated or returns with a vengeance, because I think quiet is something that we probably need now. I understand, of course, you know, that the contrary argument can be made, and that there are many people who are climbing up the wall and wanting a bit of noise and action in their lives.
I think it was only that period before the vaccines where people were in lockdown. They really just didn't go out at all, and it was deemed dangerous. And I can remember vividly, there was a day when I thought, I've got to get out and walk and get some exercise and really, you know, get moving here. And I walked to Midtown, and it was like being in an episode of The Twilight Zone. There was maybe one or two people on Fifth Avenue. And I thought, yes, please bring back the tourists, bring back the office workers. We can't live this way. You know, it's really bad.
Did you find, Joe, I don't know whether you noticed this in New York, but I certainly noticed it here in Edinburgh, that in that first period, and I agree that the first couple of months were the strangest period, when everything was very new, and we were quite shocked by what was happening. But I noticed that people actually greeted one another in the street. Strangers greeted one another in the street. Now, I don't know if that happened in New York, but I certainly noticed it. Our shared experience seemed to promote that.
I don't know that greeting happened, but there was certainly more civility. There was even a community spirit, which you rarely see in a big city. But for months, at the end of every day, there would be people hanging out of windows, banging pots and pans to thank the nurses,
yes,
the frontline workers, etc.
Yes.
That doesn't happen anymore, but mercifully, we're no longer in that period
Yes.
of lockdown.
Yes.
How did you, can I get to the writing? This would be fascinating.
Sure.
Someone who's written so many books, I think readers are always interested in process. Do you have a set routine, or do you write whenever you can? During the pandemic, for instance, I was locked out of my usual place of work, which is the Northwick Library. It was closed down. So I found myself writing this last book on the dining room table with who knows what going on all around you. And I thought, it's possible to do this. But what's your usual routine? How do you produce 70 books? The rest of us are so.
Well, you produce a fair number of books as well, and I know about your routine, and I stand in admiration of it, because I've seen you heading off to the New York Public Library in a very organized fashion, far more organized than I am. But I think that we're probably both agreed, and I think this would probably apply to both of us, that we have taken the advice given to writers, always been given to writers. And I think you may correct me on this, but I think it was Ernest Hemingway who talked about the necessity of sitting in front of the desk, sitting down at the desk, and actually forcing yourself to write. Now, people do attribute a lot of advice to Hemingway, some of which presumably he never gave, but I think he may have advised that. I've certainly credited him with it, and so I think you have to have a regime where you put in a certain number of hours, because the muse is not going to come along and tap you on the shoulder. I think the muse is far too busy doing other things, and so inspiration won't necessarily come in that way. So I do have a routine. I get up very early in the morning, usually, and so I'm up at 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes a little bit earlier, say 3:30, and that, of course, is a very nice time to be up and about, because nobody else is up and about, and so the phone isn't going to ring, and people aren't going to send you emails, and generally speaking, you're going to be left to yourself. It is, however, it's a slightly odd time. The Irish, I gather, call it the hour of the wolf. It's a lonely time when everybody is a stranger, so to speak. But I find that there are a couple of hours then that I get a lot done, and then I will write a little bit more during the day. So the answer to your question is I try to have about 3 hours of the day in which I can write, and I suspect you do a bit more than that, but I certainly find that 3 hours. I'm very fortunate in that I find that when I write, I sit at the keyboard. You write with a pen, don't you, Joe? Yeah. Well, I sit at the keyboard, and I go into what I think the psychiatrists call a minor dissociative state, when you're there, but you're not really there. And I don't actually have to think about what is going to happen next on the page. It's a very peculiar thing. I think it probably amounts to being in touch with that part of the mind that is creating fiction, that is asking what-if questions about the world, which actually is interrogating the world, and which is coming up with solutions, or language centers of the brain, perhaps, where sentences are being produced without real deliberate cogitative effort, and it comes out. So it's do about 1,000 words an hour. My journalist friends all sort of throw their hands up and say, "Oh, 1,000 words an hour, I wish we could do it." Of course, it's different. I mean, writing fiction is very different from writing non-fiction. Non-fiction, I don't think you can write 1,000 words an hour, because you've got to really check everything that you write, and you've got to have all the facts at your disposal. But I don't really deliberate very much. I find that there obviously must be some thought going on in the background, but it's subconscious. Does that resonate with you at all? Do you do a similar thing?
Utterly familiar. I mean, I usually refer to it as my fugue state. And one of the reasons I like to walk to the library, which is a good 2 miles, is that if you decide to say something like, "What would she say now?" it will never come. What you do is you just walk along, but the question's always in the back of your mind, and somehow you begin to hear the dialogue. You're there and not there, just as you described. By the way, another person who gave similar advice was Flaubert, who said, "Be bourgeois in your work, and therefore always pretend you're a clerk." Be an
Yes. Now, Flaubert, I've read somewhere, and I think this is correct, that Flaubert wrote 37 words a week, which is not very, is not very many. I mean, they were very good words, and of course they were in French, but only 37, which must have taken a very long time to
You should have taken up series writing.
Yes, yes, yeah. Do you find? I mean, I mentioned the using a word processor, and I remember when word processing was first invented. And isn't it wonderful to be in a position, Joe, where we can say to one another, I remember when word processing was invented. All the 20-year-olds would say, what? What? But to remember when word processing was invented, people were wondered about what the effect would be on prose. And I remember reading an article in the London Times in which somebody said, oh, well, this is going to be dreadful. Prose is going to become really flabby. Logorrhea is going to set in, and people will just sort of spew out this rather flabby prose. And then I read a book by a philosopher. I think the title was Electric Language, which was looking at some of the philosophical implications of word processing. Afraid I can't remember the name of the author, but that was a more profound analysis of the effect on thought of writing on the screen. But the point about all this is, do you notice a difference if you try to type something onto the screen? Does it sound different? Or if you try to dictate it, does it sound different from the way it sounds when you use your pen on the paper?
I've never dictated, so I don't know as to that. I think it depends on what you're actually writing. I think that writing email has become loosey-goosey compared to writing memos in the past or letters.
Yeah.
I think if you're sitting there writing a novel, no matter what implement or mechanism you're using, there's still an underlying seriousness, and you're constantly shaping it and looking at it and going back and correcting.
Yes.
So it isn't necessarily, spewing it out. Nevertheless, I can remember, one of the problems I had with word processing, partly this is just superstition. I started writing in longhand because I was working at the library and they didn't have portals for word processors when I started. And I'm used to it. It's just the way I tend to do it. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against using word processing. But I found that when I first started doing it as an old typist, I would go wham, 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 and sort of whack the keys in this way, as if you were in a Ex MacArthur sort of movie about
Yes.
1920s, pounding the pianos to get the front page out, and
Yes.
the keys, So I shied away from it. I just, I ultimately put it in. What I do is I tend to write in longhand, get the whole thing done, and then sit there and for 3 agonizing weeks, put it into the computer.
Right.
Which constitutes a first pass, because as you're typing it in, you're looking at stuff you haven't seen in a few months and you're going, oh no, she wouldn't say that. And so you could make as you go. And then finally I work from the printout of that. So it's a combination of the two.
So there are various layers of creation in the manuscripts, rather like Proust. So if you look at Proust's manuscripts, they're constantly changed. There are all sorts of lines, taking paragraphs and putting them elsewhere. Must have been a typesetter's nightmare, really, dealing with that.
There was a similar wonderful thing. A friend of mine who was a great musician, or cared a great deal about music, was at a library where they had discovered some manuscript by Beethoven. And he said, you cannot imagine the thrill, because you would literally see these blobs of ink where he was forcing the notes and you could hear it. This ink kind of clotting up, and you just knew what was going on in his head and how it would sound, et cetera, et cetera. So there are those levels.
Well, I must say that the librarians or the archivists will be so pleased to hear that you still use a pen, because at least you are creating manuscripts of the sort that can be lodged in a library in Bloomington, Indiana, whereas most of us are just creating this this material in the ether, and nobody's going to be terribly interested in looking at our USB storage devices. They don't have quite the same feel as a manuscript. Every so often I've been faced with the dilemma as to whether, when I'm asked for an original manuscript for an auction or something of that sort, a page, please just give us a page of your manuscript, a poem or something of that sort. I actually do have to sit down and take the typescript and write it out in longhand, just so that, just all for charitable purposes. I hasten to point out.
All to help the charities, right?
All for charity.
I don't know. I think biographers of the future are going to have their work cut out for them, because it's not like finding a bunch of letters that were, tied up in ribbon. You're out. I mean, everything is available, but everything is out there in the ether. I wouldn't begin to know how to go about getting it.
Oh, I stand in such admiration of biographers. Anyway, when you read a detailed biography, I just can't imagine how they got all that information. And of course, nowadays, so few people write letters anyway. Emails don't have the literary style of letters, although there are some people who write a good email and you get a nicely constructed email, but for the most part they're very functional. And I say we don't have
they don't have that sort of literary imperative. I mean, I think one of the most extraordinary exchanges of letters that I've ever read were the ones between Evelyn Waugh and Nancy Mitford. And what happens is that they're each of them giving their best in doing this, because the recipient is somebody they respect and admire, and they don't want to be caught out as being infelicitous or ungrammatical or anything. And they're little pieces of work. They're just wonderful, these letters back and forth. And you think, well, it's, if you're trying to please your recipient, you kind of come up to the standard you would like to have set.
Yes.
Now that you work on the computer, however, and produce all the, can I ask about one of the things that I think is different about what we do is that I have never written a series. And do you find that there's a sort of tension or dilemma between a readership that wants the comfort and the familiarity of what has come before, and your desire to sort of take the character further in a narrative arc?
Well, I think that's
you don't want the people to be static, and they're not in your books. And how do you work with that, and also with aging?
Well, I think that those are two very interesting questions there. I think that firstly, the series readers do enjoy coming back to characters whom they've spent time with in a previous novel. I think that's the real attraction of a series. So if you take an extreme example, the Patrick O'Brien books, I think that we meet Jack Aubrey in the first book of his that we read, and we're so taken by the characters of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin that we just really want to spend more time with them and understand a bit more about them. There's that. There's I suppose the pleasure that the reader gets in making a more profound connection with a character, in that characters in the series do become almost friends of the reader. We feel that we know the character. I mean, it's very interesting listening to the way in which people describe what a favorite literary character does. They will say, oh, well, she always likes to say such and such, or she always does that, and we like the way she does. And then they describe the particular characteristic that appeals to them. And I think that that's really, in a sense, that's a concomitant of friendship. What we're seeing there is just the development of friendship, and the familiar is very important in friendship. We want to see the same sort of thing about our friend that has appealed to us at the beginning. So if you write a series of books, I think you have to recognize what it is that you're doing, and you have to acknowledge that there are going to be expectations, and perfectly legitimate expectations from the reader as to how the characters are going to behave. And it's all very well for the author to say, well, I'm in control and I can do whatever I like with the fate of these characters. But I think that that's really not recognizing the implicit bargain between the writer of the series and the reader of the series. I suppose, to use contemporary cliche, you lose ownership of the characters, and I think that I've, to a great extent, with the Botswana novels, of which I've written 22 so far about Mma Ramotswe and her friends, I would very readily say that I've lost ownership of the characters. I can only only permit them to do that which falls within the ambit of the reader's expectations. So I think that constitutes a bit of a limitation. I don't regard that as being a major problem in any respect, because the characters become real for me, and I know the way they're going to behave. I know they want, and I don't want to harm them. There are issues, of course, if you need to get rid of a character, that can be a very painful decision and very difficult decision. And of course, it's a decision that the writer is probably likely to regret later on. And I've certainly removed 2 of my characters and regretted it in each case. But there is this tension between, I suppose, the desire to say something maybe a bit novel, and the reader's expectation or desire that you shouldn't say anything novel. So I'm aware of that. I respect it. I will introduce some new aspects, some surprises, try to get them in, but without unsettling anybody in the process, because that would lead to real disappointment on the reader's part. Now, that, in a way, I suppose you could say that sounds like really an abandonment of the freedom that a writer should have and exercise, but I don't really regard that as too much of a problem. One thing which I think, sorry, this is a rather long-winded answer to your question. One thing is very interesting, and that is the question of chronological exactitude, which is basic respect for chronology. And I must say, I have to hold up my hands and confess that I don't pay much attention to that. So my characters in my Scotland Street series, I've got young Bertie, who starts off the series. There are 15 books in that series so far. Young Bertie, who's a favorite character of mine and has a lot of support in the readership. He starts off aged 6, and he's 6 for 8 years. And then eventually I give him a 7th birthday. I feel that I have to. So other people, other characters have in fact moved on a bit and have, but Bertie's really trapped in that. And I don't want him to grow up. He wants to grow up, and he's always saying that he wants to be 18 so he can leave his mother and go and live in Glasgow, which for him is a beautiful city on the hill, away from the oppression of his life in Edinburgh. But I haven't done that. I don't observe technological change in the world, in that in my Number One Ladies Detective Agency series, there are no mobile phones, no cell phones. They don't have them. And of course, if you go to Botswana, if you go to contemporary Botswana, everybody's talking on their cell phones all the time, but not in the world that I've created. I've stopped mentioning typewriters. I don't think I talk about typewriters. I kept typewriters going for well after they had ceased to exist in offices, but they haven't got any computers. Computers, of course, you see, the problem with computers and with Google and so on is that they actually make the detective novel, if we're talking about the detective novel, the classic detective novel where there's a mystery to be solved or information to be elicited somehow from the situation, that actually ruins it, because if you want the answer to any question these days, you Google it and you get the answer immediately. And so all the facts are there. It's rather like antibiotics in opera. Antibiotics would just ruin opera because Mimi could be dying of tuberculosis. And they'd say, oh, penicillin, a bit of penicillin, and you only have act one. So,
but this is one of the great advantages of books over film. I mean, you can write a series and create the world that you want, and it can still exist in that form. On TV or in the theaters, a child will grow up over the years. You have to make accommodations for that. So,
exactly. I mean, that is a big problem for the child actors, isn't it? When the child actors start growing up, and the screenwriters still want them age 10 or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Mind you, of course, Joe, you see, this is where I think you're speaking from a position of great comfort, because you know, I'm not going to accuse you of being in a time warp, but you're definitely placed in a particular time. We know that when we read your books, that, you know, we're back in the late 40s, early 50s, whatever the and so you really don't have to worry about mobile phones and all this stuff. So I think that's a great luxury. My Mma Ramotswe books are a little bit like that. I'm stuck in the 1980s with Mma Ramotswe. I pretend that we're in the 21st century, but we are actually a few decades out. Whereas you're unashamedly back in 1950 or whatever. And
when I could still understand the technology, yes.
But you see, but it's also more the world in a way. I don't know whether we're you know, one mustn't romanticize past periods unduly, but in a way there were more possibilities for the sort of moral dilemmas and the sort of conflicts, internal conflicts and so on in those days. These days, could you really, I mean, it's quite difficult to create a tortured character, because everybody can indulge themselves. Nobody's going to be, shame's gone. You see, shame was a very big thing for novelists, don't you think? No shame now. Nobody need be ashamed of anything.
No shame and no secrets. I mean, which is a real problem for the sort of books that I write. I mean, if everything is known and everything can be known, who's keeping what secret? I once said to somebody that the kind of spy scene that is dramatic is not somebody going through a hard disk and ferreting out information. It's somebody meeting somebody else on a park bench and slipping a paper that has something in it. It's a standard scene. It's been used a million times, and it still works because it's about the interaction of these two people getting away with something. I think it's the one thing that makes it easier for you in the series, this business of, you know, what do we want to do with characters and how do we violate the characters we've already set up, is that they are so vividly drawn that it doesn't become a real issue. I know we've been kidding around, but an unsolicited testimonial. This is like the world of Dickens, you know. I mean, many of Dickens' characters end exactly the way they began. They're the same character. They are developed in between, but they don't fundamentally go through that kind of sea change. But they are revered by the readers. They are vividly drawn. We're 150 years out and we're still enthralled by them. So, you know, the great secret, I think, is to make the characters real.
And I think, yes, I think that's right. And I think also that one should avoid too many contemporary references. I did an event yesterday, a real life event in St Andrews, a university town in the east of Scotland. They're a really lovely place. And I did one of, I suppose, physical events, which are a bit rare at the moment in current circumstances. And I was asked by, there was my audience in front of me. There were a couple of hundred people sitting in this hall, all masked. And it was quite difficult to understand the readers' questions, actually, because they were all talking behind these masks when they asked them. And one person said, "Are you going to deal with COVID in your novels? Are you going to bring COVID into your novels? And I said, I don't think I would, because I think that if you put in too many specific contemporary references, you lose that potential universality, and it shows. And so people don't regard the narrative or the characters as really applying out with that particular setting. So I think that we need to universalize, and I think that's in your books. There are these universal issues that come up. I mean, we know where we are. You've got a very strong sense of place and a very strong sense of period, but there are universal things. That place and that time actually throws up these universal issues, which I think is something that we look for in spy fiction, because spy fiction, we want it to discuss loyalty, and we want it to discuss secrets, obviously. I was having a conversation the other night. We had a couple of guests in for dinner, and one of them revealed that his brother had worked for many years in the security services, British security services. I don't know whether he was MI5 or MI6, but anyway, he was one, and he'd been posted all over the world in these. And he said that his brother had said that the spying profession was not what it used to be, because now all it is people sitting in solitary offices hacking. So it's just all the computer hackers hacking into other people's computer systems and analyzing computer traffic, email traffic. And so the idea of the park bench is empty now, Joe. It's very sad, isn't it?
So for purposes of the novels, we can't leave the Cold War, because after that, it becomes, strictly speaking, just technology. Yeah. But I think there's another reason for writing in period, I think we do not understand the world as it goes on around us in real time, but we have the perspective of history to understand. It's a little like being involved in a battle. Mm-hmm. It's all a mess while it's happening. It's only later that you can analyze what actually was taking place and who was bringing up the rear and who was leading the assault from this area, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And you begin to get a much more rational picture of what was mm-hmm. actually happening at that time. Yes. Or at least I think so. It's sort of one of the reasons that I'm drawn to it. Yes. It's a more understandable world that we can be writing about, which means that the platform is there, and you can then explore the things that really interest you, which I think also happens in your books, which are these ethical and moral dilemmas. I once said to somebody about one of the books, what do you do when there's no right thing to do? Just do not so right things, or is it going to be the least bad, or how is it not going to affect somebody? I think we're faced with situations like that, and certainly they appear in your books. I think we're faced every day. It's just if you're writing about spies doing it, it's at the exponential level. This is, there's this dichotomy between the public face and the private face. But if you're a spy, you're lying all the time. You're often lying to your family, your spouse, certainly your colleagues, your country. Yes. It's, a little bit of what we do, spies do at an extreme. And I think consequently they become much more dramatic. But by the way, can I take 1 minute, because you reminded me about the questions from the audience, that halfway through this, I'm supposed to say, if anybody out there listening has a question, will you email it to reservations@writersblockpresents.com. And now I've done my duty for Writer's Block, and I hope you have a question. But can I ask you one more question about the series? Because it interests me. I think that one of the glories of all of the series actually are your wonderful titles. I think Tears of the Giraffe, Morality for Beautiful Girls, The Right Attitude to Reign, Portuguese Irregular Verbs, and on and on. I mean, I delight in them. And I was curious about this. Is it all over the map? Do you have them sometimes early? Do you have to, I mean, I find either I know it going in, or it's like pulling teeth to get it right at the end. And do you ever ask feedback on them, or how?
Yes, I do. Yes, it's to a certain extent the titles are committee business, in that I usually come up with one or two ideas. Sometimes I go straight to the title that we eventually use, and you've probably had that experience as well, where you know right at the beginning that this is a title that nobody's going to object to, and it's going to do exactly what you want it to do. Now that's something of the exception, I find, in my case, but I will often get something which approximates to the eventual title, and what it requires then is a certain amount of massaging by editors and agents. And they look at it and come up with suggestions. And often these suggestions will determine the title. Although I probably would say in most cases, I've come up with at least the basic idea. I had a rather interesting experience with a title just last week, in that the next book in my Botswana series is going to be, which I haven't yet started to write, because I often choose the title, and indeed the cover is chosen before I start writing the book. But it's going to be called, we decided that it would be called The Song of Comfortable Chairs. And that was agreed upon. And then my New York editor, Edward Kastenmeier, who's very, very good with titles. Edward has a great ear for the right title. He made a mistake in writing this title down in some internal document when it was going to sales committees or whatever it was. And he described the book as A Song of Comfortable Chairs. And then somebody pointed out to him that he changed the title, and so he got in touch with me and said, I must confess that I've made a mistake with the title, but I rather like it, and people say that the mistake is rather good. And indeed, he was right, because changing from the definite to the indefinite article there not only changes the meaning of the title in a way which I regard as very satisfactory, it also changes the sound of the title, which is so important. You can't, and The Song of Comfortable Chairs is a hard start. It's an uncomfortable start. The stress is on the first word, as opposed to A Song of Comfortable Chairs, where the stress is on the second word, and is much more satisfactory. So I wrote back to him and said, often a mistake, a typo, is a happy mistake, and quoted the case of W.H. Auden writing his letter from Iceland, and the principal poem in that has a line where he says, where in fact, if you look at Auden's works today, you'll see that is down as where the ports have names for the sea. Now, that's a very peculiar line. It's a sort of personification, as if the ports sit down and discuss, what are we going to call this sea? Where the ports have, and in fact, Auden had written where the poets have names for the sea, which of course made sense. But when he saw the typo, he said, that's much better.
Yes.
and the poem went out in that form. So titles, yeah, titles are terribly important, and titles and what is on the jacket can kill a book stone dead. You know, I think if you get that wrong, then terrible things will happen.
No, I agree that one should always listen to the advice of the professionals that surround you, particularly since I'm a former publisher, and so naturally. But occasionally it goes wrong. One of the titles that was there immediately for me was The Good German, and in some part because you would read accounts of the occupation forces sending back letters saying, you know, but we need to change the Bürgermeister, but only with the good Germans.
Yeah.
Who exactly would that be? You know, following Hitler and the war, et cetera, et cetera. So it was always the title going in, until I encountered my late revered German publisher, Karl Blessing, whose advice I would always take. And I was so pleased that he liked the book because I was sensitive about how Germans would react to it, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, no, Joe, it's wonderful. This is all fine. But the title has to go. You can't use the good German in Germany. And I said, why not? It means exactly the same thing, ironically. He said, no, it's like All American Boy. And I said, no, it isn't. It's frequently used. No, I will come up with something else. So he came up with In den Ruinen von Berlin, in the ruins of Berlin. And I said, really, Carl? He said, yes, everybody will recognize it. Marlena sang it as a song and it's evocative. So I said, well, fine. I then go to Germany to do some promotion for the book. And every single interview began with, Herr Kanon, I understand that you have changed the title for Germany. Why would you change the title? And I said, Carl, every interview I've given is about changing the title. And he said, you can't buy that sort of publicity. So
that's very, very good. Very good.
Now, aside from titles and other reviews, I'm going to reveal something I don't know if you want revealed, but can you tell us about your bust? I mean, there are many writers who have been honored, but you are the only one I know, and certainly the only friend I have, who's got a bust in the National Gallery, yes?
Well, the National Portrait Gallery of Scotland. It's very kind of you to mention the bust. I certainly wasn't going to mention it. It was done some years ago, and I rashly agreed. I mean, it's not every day somebody comes along and says, can we make a bust of you? And so I said, yes, of course. I mean, I think it's quite rude to say people can't make a bust of you. And so I said, yes, that's fine. And then I realized it's actually really quite a demanding process. I had to sit for, I think, about 3 days, just sit there and while the bust was being made. And of course, it did involve a certain amount, having a bust made involves a certain amount of sort of feeling of the bumps of the head and, you know, perhaps rather more than having a portrait painted. And yes, and so this bust was made, and it's on the stairs of the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. I find it a bit embarrassing when I have visitors to Edinburgh and say, well, you must go to the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, which is worth going to. And then they come back and they say, oh yes, and we saw your bust on the stairs, as if that had been my motive. We must go, which of course it isn't. I'm very keen on portraiture. Actually, I'm very interested in portraiture, which is a bit of a poor relation in the arts these days. You know, national collections don't really spend much time on portraiture or time and money on portraiture. And so, for example, there are an awful lot of contemporary figures, you know, presidents and politicians and what, who actually don't have their portrait painted because well, it's sort of dying out. Now we've got obviously many more photographic records, but it's not quite the same as an artist's interpretation of the character behind the face. Yes, that was my bust. It's
well, I can tell you that all of your friends delight in it. It isn't every day you walk into a museum and I go, God, there's Sandy. And I mean, I thought you had already reached the height of fame when I got the 44 Scotland tea towel, which I still have and we use with all the characters on it. I thought, not every writer gets to be a tea towel. This is fantastic.
What I do find in some of my series, such as the Scotland Street series, and to an extent the Isabel Dalhousie series, I do put real people in with their consent and give them a little cameo role, and they love it. They usually love it. They always come out rather well. You know, I never put anything nasty happening to a real person. So they're usually very pleased about that. And I must tell you a story. Some years ago, in an earlier volume of the Scotland Street stories, I was at some function and I found myself talking to the then First Minister of Scotland, who's the equivalent of the Scottish Prime Minister. And there I was talking to Jack McConnell, who was our First Minister at the time. And he said that he was reading the Scotland Street books, which appear as a serial novel in the newspapers. So a lot of people read them in that form. And I said to him, just as a matter of courtesy, well, First Minister, would you like to be in the book? And he said, well, yes, I wouldn't mind. And so I was then in a rather difficult position of having to try and think what role I could give him in the book. And so what I did was I had young Bertie crossing the street, crossing a busy street, aged then 6, and getting stuck in the middle of the street. And there's a bus coming down the hill, careering towards Bertie. I mean, a real classic, this is a very classic scene. And Bertie freezes. And it just so happens that the First Minister of Scotland's walking up the pavement and sees Bertie frozen in the middle of the road with the bus approaching. And so he bravely rushes out and rescues him and brings him to safety. So I wrote this section, and I usually, when I put real people into the books, I show the excerpt to the person in question. So we sent this to the press secretary of the First Minister and said, show this to the First Minister and just check up that that's all right with him. And within 45 minutes, back came the response, which was very satisfactory, very satisfactory. He'd had a sort of bad press recently, and this is exactly what he wanted, was to be seen to be rescuing a 6-year-old boy from the traffic. So I do enjoy putting, and the people who are in the book, they really very much like their role. And in fact, one of them, who's a former director of the Portrait Gallery, as it happens, James Holloway, he was very, very pleased when I gave him a speaking role in one of the books. He came into the plot as a friend of one of the characters, that he had a T-shirt made which said very prominently, "I am a character in 44 Scotland Street." So what I don't do is, I don't know whether you've had this experience of people asking whether you would do a charity auction for a name appearance and in one of the books, where somebody bids at an auction and then they could come into the. I don't do that because that would devalue the merited appearance of the other rail characters.
Yeah, I've never done it either. I've heard of it being done.
Yeah.
Was it different writing 44 Scotland since you had a weekly deadline?
Well, no. In fact, Scotland Street had rather interesting origin because I had been. This is going way back. I'd been at a party in San Francisco at Amy Tan's house, and Amy had said that when you come to San Francisco, we'll have a party and invite various people. And one of the people she invited was Armistead Maupin, he of Tales of the City. And I had this conversation with Armistead, and Armistead is a very agreeable, very pleasant man, and we had this chat. And he said to me, whatever you do, don't write a serial novel in the newspaper, because he had, of course, written Tales of the City in the San Francisco Chronicle. So I came back to Scotland, and I was asked by one of the newspaper's editors here to write a little piece about my recent US tour, which I wrote, and I described this conversation with Armistead in San Francisco. And the editor said, let's meet for lunch. And you've got to be terribly careful when editors of newspapers say, let's meet for lunch, because there's usually an agenda there somewhere. And anyway, I went along and he said, you said that it's a pity that newspapers don't have serial novels. You're on. And I very rashly said, that's fine, I'll do it. And then I realized I didn't have the first clue what this would be about. And the newspaper was beginning to spend money on advertising this, and it was all set up. And I didn't have any idea at all what I'd write about. And it's a real serial novel, because Scotland Street book, I do a chapter a day, which is Living Dangerously. if you look at Dickens did a chapter a month, I think, 12,000 words, all the same. Actually, if you look at Dickens chapters, Joe, I don't know whether you've taken your magnifying glass to his chapters, but usually Dickens chapters end with the characters going to sleep. In so many cases, it's a really peculiar thing. Suddenly everybody falls asleep. And it happens time and time again. It's rather like our having people drinking tea or smoking a cigarette.
Or like a good children's book, which always ends going to sleep.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, children's authors don't even try it. I mean, they wouldn't get away with it, but Dickens got away with it. The characters just drift off into sleep. But Dickens did, of course, I think those were monthly. And I don't think Tales of the City was daily. I don't know how often it appeared. But I agreed to do a daily chapter, 1,200 words a day, for a period of usually about, it was Monday to Friday, so I had the weekend off. And they'd run in the paper, Scotsman newspaper, for about 3 months of the year, and then come out as books. And touching all available wood, I haven't thus far missed a deadline. Sometimes been rather close. There was one occasion in which my wife and I were on the Queen Mary, the big cruise liner or ocean liner. We'd been invited to go. It was the original free lunch, which doesn't exist, but we've said we could go around South America in return for 3 talks, and off we went. And as the ship went round the Horn down at the bottom of South America, the internet went down for some reason. So I had been sending chapters back to HQ in Scotland, and suddenly I couldn't send the latest chapters back. And I think they had about 3 in the bank, so to speak, which they could use. And I was getting really worried because this, the readers might suddenly find that the serial stopped. And then as we went round the corner, so to speak, and went into a large fjord, a Chilean fjord, suddenly the internet came back on, and the chapters were able to be dispatched back to Scotland. So that was the only occasion in which writing a serial novel proved to be very, very hairy. It was, and it had a happy ending. I remember when the internet came back on, we were approaching this great big glacier at the end of this, named after, I think, Pope Pius IX, Pio Nono Glacier. And I remember thinking, not very complimentary to have a glacier named after you. I would have thought that one would, of the geographical features one would like to be remembered by, a glacier probably wasn't first on the list. Such a cold type.
I'm going to jump right in here because we're moving towards the end of the hour, and there a bunch of questions have come in, and so I'm going to ask you a few, and I thank you so much for this. This has been so completely fun and informative. I'm going to start with mine because I get to do that. Sandy, you're a retired professor of medical law at the University of Edinburgh. When you were teaching, did you have 1,000 ideas for novels, or did they just percolate? What happened? Explain.
Well, I did in the days when I had my honest job, so to speak. I did write. I wrote a lot of children's books. I wrote over 40 children's books. I got sort of rather caught up in doing that, and I wrote short stories. So yes, I did have lots of ideas coming to me during that period, and I wrote in my spare time. I think most writers have to have another job to keep body and soul together and to get going, and so they write in the interstices of their other commitments. So that was the case with me.
Where do you feel most at home in your novels? In Botswana or Edinburgh or someplace else entirely?
I think I probably feel at home in most of the places in which the books are set. I feel, I suppose, mostly at home when I'm writing about the city in which I live, when I'm writing about Edinburgh or Scotland generally. That's perhaps not surprising. But I do set the books, as Joe does as well. I mean, Joe has quite a number of different locations for his, and he set Istanbul and Berlin and whatnot. I enjoy writing about other places. So I've set quite a few of my short stories in Australia. I'm fascinated by the landscape of the Australian interior. The outback is just amazing, and those hardy, resourceful people who live there. So I do take those settings. None of us, I think, really quite matches Graham Greene in respect of the breadth of the choice of setting. And Greene, of course, had a particular nose for slightly run down, slightly suspect settings, and he did those very effectively.
Or his favorite adjective, seedy.
Seedy, yes.
Seedy.
Yes. And of course, there is that term Greenland with an E, talking about his world. And I don't wish to embarrass Joe, but I've often thought that Joe had stepped straight into the shoes of Graham Greene. Joe's the closest thing we have to Graham Greene at the moment.
There is no higher compliment. Thank you.
So actually, that brings me right to another question for both of you. Who are some exciting emerging spy writers who write about the present time, who use cell phones and who can Google?
Sandy, you take that first.
Well, I'm realizing that I'm not really reading any absolutely contemporary spy fiction. I'm really, my reading is about the period of the period of the Cold War, or the period that Joe writes about. I'm a very great fan of Ben McIntyre's books. I think Ben McIntyre's books about espionage both during the Second World War and in the period, well, I suppose Ben would also dealt with the 1930s, the earlier 1930s, and with the Cold War period until quite recently. And of course, that's not fiction. That, of course, is just so beautifully written that it reads like the most gripping fiction that you can imagine, but it's all absolutely true. So I read that sort of thing. I'll devour anything that he writes in that area. But I'm not sure whether I'm au fait with absolutely up to the minute as spy fiction. Probably not.
I tend to favor the historical as well. Of contemporaries, I think Olin Steinhauer is terrific, and he certainly writes about contemporary CIA doings.
Right.
I myself have never been in the secret world, although if you say that at a book event, people will usually say, well, of course you would say that. So you can't really get away with much.
Yeah.
I think there's a ton of good stuff being written. And, whenever you're asked exactly who, your mind goes blank because you think, I don't want to offend somebody by mentioning somebody else. And so you get into that sort of conundrum. But I think this whole business of, there's a corollary question, if I can riff on this for a minute, of influence, because one of the things that may surprise you is that both Sandy and I are great fans of Patricia Highsmith. And it seemed to me nobody could be less like the books that we do. I mean, she's a completely different writer. And it, I think, makes the point that when people talk about who has influenced you, the real answer should be everything I've ever read. It all goes into the making of who you are. When you are automatically choosing a word without even being aware that you're choosing a word in your writing, you've been influenced by everybody you've read. So people who answer things like, oh, Shakespeare, of course, it's everybody, and it's high, low, and middle. It's just, that's influence.
Yeah.
Right. That's a perfect place to end this great discussion. I so appreciate both of you being here. This is such a fun book, The Joy and Light Bus Company and the Berlin Exchange, which I love. Anyway, Book Soup has these books, and go to our website to get a link to them. Thank you so very much. I so appreciate it. Have a great 2022, and I'll see you soon. And to both of you, our authors, huge, great thanks.
Andrea, remember Salinger when Holden Caulfield says, the way you know a good book is that when you finish, you wish the author were a friend of yours and you could call him up. Luckily, Sandy is a friend of mine, so I can call him up, but this has been even more fun. We can do it on Zoom. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
We'll
Bye-bye.
talk
Bye-bye. Bye.